good morning, and welcome to another Clearwater Jazz Holiday Foundation's Young Lions Jazz Master Virtual Sessions. I am your guest host, Michael Kernodle, and you already see the man with the plan that's on the screen in front of you. Another great session by the professor, Brandon Robertson. And guess what the topic is today? 5 ways to improve your sound amplification. We know we have plenty of bass players here, and that's something that a lot of people struggle with, is how can I get the best sound out of the instrument? Well, there's no better person to tell you than the Professor Brandon Robertson. But I want to remind you, as you come in, you have any questions, go into the chat feature, type it in there, and we're going to leave some time near the end for our educators to answer those questions. And, we wouldn't be here without our sponsors today. So I want you to be sure to check out the studio archives of our past video sessions at clearwaterjazz.com's education outreach section. That's brought to you by Blue Water Wealth Management at Stewart Partners and Duke Energy, as well as Young Lions podcast available wherever you stream. And that's brought to you by our friends at Marine Max Clearwater. Just search Young Lions Jazz Master Virtual Sessions wherever you stream. I mean, where do we begin? I mean, you've had so many great sessions from Brandon. Just to name a few, I love the What I Love About series. So you had Paul Chambers, Jaco Storis, Christian McBride, my man. I love that. He did all those great sessions. And of course, he did fundamental and technique sessions as well, kind of like, hey, how to develop melodic bass lines, 2-5-1s. But you know what? You have to go back in the archives and enjoy all that great stuff. And if you don't know this amazing, amazing man right here, Brandon Robertson is an Emmy-nominated, you heard it right, Emmy-nominated music director, professional upright electric bassist, composer, and music educator, originally from none other than Tampa Bay, Florida.
Tampa. Let's get that right.
Tampa, but he has his Bachelor's of Arts in Music from Florida State University in 2009 and a Master's in Music and Jazz Studies in spring 2016. Look at him. And currently, he's a director of jazz studies and a director of the FGCU basketball band. I'm pretty sure they say it like that at the game. For Gulf Coast University of Fort Myers. I mean, hey, the guy's everywhere playing on the stages, but today, you're going to get a great education from the professor. So without any further ado, Professor, the stage is all yours.
Man, how do I come back from those intros, man? Every week I keep telling myself, like, this is the week that I'm going to break down crying. And, you almost had me there. You almost had me. So I appreciate the beautiful introduction, as always, to the Clearwater Jazz Holiday Foundation, your family. So thank you guys, as usual, for allowing me to share my knowledge with this wonderful audience. So let's get right into it, because today it's going to be a cool, interesting topic. It's not short, but it's to the point. Okay, so 5 ways on how to improve your sound amplified. Now, me being a bass player, my instrument comprises of 2 components. There's an acoustic side to that, and then there's an amplification side to it. Now, depending on the setting, the environment, the request of the band leader or whoever's asking of the bass player to provide which type of sound and accommodation, this all will determine on how you would need to adjust your sound if you're using an amp. Now, I play regularly downtown Fort Myers, here where I live, at this place called the Barrel Room. Now, that room is more of like a listening room, even though it's set up like a bar and slash restaurant. They have a stage, and they have it set up to where you can eat and listen to music, and they designed it that way. Now, there have been instances where there are nights where I will not play with an amp, and everyone outside could still hear me. Then there's nights where I'm just like, I'm going to use my amp because there's way too many people in this room, and no one will hear me because all the sound is being sucked up from the room. So if I'm playing acoustically, I'm going to get drowned out by the noise, so no one will hear me. So here's what I do when I'm in those predicaments. So this is point number one. Point number one is you need to recap, or I guess investigate the environment you're going to be playing in. So I like to always arrive to my gigs an hour, maybe just depending on what the show is, what I'm doing, but maybe like an hour and a half, but usually an hour before I have to start playing. A lot of times I get there an hour before so I'm not late. You know, with traffic or accidents, anything can happen. But then a lot of times what I'm doing is I'm scoping the room. I'm trying to get a feel for wherever I'm playing at. Do I really need my amp? If I do need my amp, where should I place it? You know, so I'm kind of scoping and investigating the area. So as a bass player, you need to go and look in your environment. So if you're playing indoors, the spacing matters because it matters where you put your amp, and then B, where you're placing it to let the people hear you also matters. So if you're on a stage indoors, for instance, you would probably want your amp to face the center or somewhere where the sound is pushing out towards the audience, right? But let's say if you're playing outdoors, depending on where you're set up outdoors, you might have to sometimes put the amp in front of you instead of behind you, because if you're further away and the amp is behind you and you're standing in front of your amp or somewhere blocking the sound of it, then at this point no one is going to hear you. So making sure that you are fully aware of your environment. Look at what's around you first. Also, make sure that you have somewhere to plug in your amp, because if you're playing indoors and let's say they have you on a stage and then there's no electrical outlet for you to plug in your amp. Now, rule of thumb, bass players, always keep not one, not two, but 3 extension cords with you in your car. Keep one in your case and 2 in your car. I'm telling you right now, there will be instances where you're gonna need it. I had to learn the hard way, and I found that out later on in life. So I keep 3 extension cords in the back of my car, with the event that if something comes up and I'm like, you know what, I need it because I need to stretch and get, you know, to my setup, I'm cool. I can tell them, nope, I got extension cords, I'm taken care of. So make sure you have that. And so again, look at in your environment, make sure you have somewhere to plug in. Also making sure that you have enough space to put your amp, because I have been in instances where I've been hired to play at places where I didn't have room to bring my amp in, so I had to play acoustically. So that also changed my positioning of where I was going to stand and, you know, what I was going to do, because I needed people to hear the bass. So again, rule number 1, investigate your environment. Rule number 2, if you play amplified, always dial down all your EQs. Do not have a preset EQ dialed in to your amp. Now, some people are going to challenge me on that. I'm going to explain why. I have been in situations where I will have a pre-dial-up setup, and then I will get to a venue where they have their own sound crew, and I say, hey, you know, da-da-da, and they're plugging me in, they're doing their thing, and then somehow whatever they're doing with the sound is messing up my presets that I have on my amp. It's not blending in right. So then I had to go in there and rechange everything. I learned real quickly that there will be times where I can't use the same presets. Like, this is not something that happens often. Like, most of the time, if you have a preset, it'll work. Like, you know, you don't have to change anything. But sometimes you have to adjust to your environment, and which is what I had to do. So it's always good to dial down and then adjust your EQs to the room and to wherever you're playing at. So that way it feels natural. You're always trying to shoot for a natural sound when it comes to your amplification, especially, and I stress this enough to all bass players, especially if you're playing upright, if you're playing an acoustic upright bass, you have to make that instrument sound like an acoustic bass. That's where the issue comes in when people are playing amplified through their bass. They're thinking, oh, well, now that I'm amplified, I need to be turned up to be heard. Your instrument alone is already loud because of the register of the nature of the instrument itself. The register of the instrument is already low, so you don't need to turn your amp all the way up, because if you hit your E string, you're going to feedback. Why does it feedback? Because of the frequency of that string. That range is so low, it blends in with the sound of the amp. So a lot of times I only use, and when I say I dial up the EQs, I only use enough EQ to where I can hear myself. And I try my best to sound acoustically, even when I am amplified. So what I do, here's the other thing, the third part. When you dial up, the third part, part number one, investigate. Number two, turn all your EQs down so you can adjust to the room. Number three, when you're adjusting your EQs, you have to pay attention to the mid range. So your highs and your lows are your highs and your lows are really easy to dial up, because your highs, it'll sound really thin. Your lows, it'll sound too full. But your mid range, if the mid range is off, then it'll either sound really like airy in the higher range, or it'll sound really muffled in the lower range. So what I like to do is I always set my bass dialing. I try to set it to the lowest setting as possible. I only set it to where enough to where you can feel the amplification of the bass. You can feel it, not hear it. There's a difference. You can feel it when you start playing, because the ground will start vibrating like heavily. So you know, like, okay, there's some bottom there, but you only hear the bottom. You're not hearing all of my amplified notes. You're just hearing the bottom, right? So when I start to play, it sounds very acoustically, but with a big bottom on the end. That's what you're going for. So I try to set my bass dialing as low as possible to where you could just feel the bass vibration from the bottom. I set my mids kind of on, I kind of set my mids around 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock. If you're looking at the dial, go like this. I'm kind of at about a 9, 10, like a 9 or a 10 o'clock. And then my mid is usually at 12 o'clock or 1. Okay. And I try to make it to where you can hear the middle, but you can feel the bottom, but you don't hear too much of the top. Okay, it kind of, my two B's are the balance and blend. Those are my two B's, balance and blend. This is very important when you're talking about your amplification, because you want to have a nice blending of those EQs, but a nice dynamic balance to where it sounds acoustic, just amplified. All right, so that third point is making sure that you're not dialing in, turning in your EQs too high or too low to where it sounds off. All right. Point number four is when you are in a concert setting, you want to try to fit your tone to the rest of the band. Okay. Now, what I mean by that is there's been instances where, you know, when you dial in, especially if you're running through a PA system, through the house system, if the sound crew is dialing you in through the house system, you want to make sure that all of your EQ settings on your amp are adjusted properly the way you want them to, because what's going to happen is they're dialing in settings on their end, and then your amp becomes a monitor at that point. So if your amp is adjusted all kind of differently, what you're hearing is not what's being projected out to the house. And so a lot of times You'll hear the people say, "Hey man, can you check your dial up, your EQs on your amp? Something sounds funny out here." Most of the time, it's because what most young bass players do is they're listening to the house system to try to adjust their EQs when really they need to be listening to their amp, because the amp is used as a monitor, so you can adjust that on your own. So the point number 4 is, if you're running through a PA system or a house system, you need to make sure that you're adjusting your EQs properly and it's not getting in the way of what the sound crew is doing, because then if you're doing something weird on your amp and then they're doing something in the house, it's going to sound different. Okay, it's all about the way you sound. All right, and then lastly, my last point is, this is probably the most important one. I stress to all of my young bassists, I really emphasize to them the importance of playing acoustically and only using the amp for what it's needed for, which is presence. It's not needed to be heard. You don't need the amp, especially if you're playing in a club setting or, you know, a small venue or a club setting. A music festival or outdoor festival setting is different. Yes, you need to crank that bad boy, not like blare it, but you do need to have it at a dial in at a good setting to where you're heard, like especially if you're playing electrically, you're heard and it sounds acoustic. The thing about playing electric and upright is you want to make sure that you're sounding acoustically. Okay, even when you're playing amplified, it needs to sound acoustically. It should never sound like you're playing through an amp. It should still feel as though you're playing an acoustic instrument. Even when you're playing electric bass, let's talk about that. There are settings on electric bass and there's settings on your amp. Just because you adjust the settings on your amp doesn't mean that you don't need to also do that on your actual bass. You need to adjust your, especially if you have an active or a passive bass, and there's a switch that it'll turn on and off. Some more updated modern amplifications have a passive or an active switch, and those sounds, the passive sounds, it sounds a lot more, it has a different tone. So depending on the context of what you're trying to do matters. So you want to make sure that your dial up on your actual electric is set to the tone of what you want it to. So when you start playing it on your bass, you're adjusting is just the sound on the amp. You're not adjusting it to match and get you to what you want to sound like through the bass itself. You can do that on the settings on the bass, but the sound, it needs to be adjusted on the amp. Okay, so that last part is making sure that whatever you're dialing into, you want to try to go for the most acoustic sound as possible. When you're playing upright bass, you need the amp for presence, not necessarily to be heard. You should still try to strive to play with an acoustic feel. So that means even when you're playing a ballad, like a lot of times when I play ballads amplified, I will turn my amp almost all the way down, like not all the way down, but just enough to where you can still feel the bottom, but you're hearing more of the acoustic sound from the instrument. That's what we're aiming for. Okay, so making sure that your quarter inch chords are all working and there's no buzzing, because if there's some buzzing, if you have a bad chord, that'll create some bad buzzing within your amp. Also check for buzzing in your amp, you know, if you've spilled water or anything, because you don't want that to tweak your sound a little bit. There's one more point too that I want to make. Some amplifications have a mute button on there. I will always recommend to young bass players that if you have that mute button, turn the mute button on. Because what happens, sometimes you forget that your pickup is feedbacking from the actual amp, and if you just sit your bass down and your pickup is facing the actual amp, it'll feedback. So just make sure you mute your amp if you don't turn your amp completely off. Okay, so just to kind of recap of what I went through. Number one, you need to make sure that you're adjusting to your environment, or go and investigate your environment. Look around and make sure you have outlets, you have proper stage spacing, proximity. You want to make sure that everything is there that's needed for you. I recommended that you keep extension cords and a couple of extra 1/4-inch cords with you, so that way if something doesn't work, you have a backup. If you need an extension cord, if they say, hey, the plug is way over there, we don't have one right behind the stage, you have a cord that'll reach all the way over there. Take care of that. Number 2, you want to make sure that that you turn all of your EQs down if you're going through the house, and then adjust from there. So that way you can get the same type of tone and the sound that you want. Again, you're still going for an amplified sound. You're not going for you're not trying to be heard. You want to be felt. Okay. Then number 3, while you're being dialed in through the house, you need to make sure that you're adjusting your EQs accordingly, and you're not messing around with all of the settings on your amp if they're trying to adjust you through the house, because it'll sound differently. It won't come off the same. Okay. Then number 4, you want to make sure that when you are playing acoustically, like I told you guys before, the dial up, like having your bass dial all the way somewhat down so you can still feel the bottom, but having your mids around 9-10 o'clock excuse me, and then your highs around noon to 1, and then just kind of mess around with that's my setting. That's what I use, and it seemed to work. But everybody's bass is built differently, and everyone's bass is set up differently. It has different wooding on it, so you just have to adjust to your instrument. And then lastly, making absolute sure that everything properly is working, making sure that acoustically that you're going for more of an acoustic sound, making sure that on your electric bass that you're adjusting all the settings on the instrument first before you try to do that on the amp, so that way it all sounds the same. And so if you do these things, that will really help eliminate time wasted on trying to get a good sound on stage. It'll eliminate you having to figure out, like, okay, what's going on here? I don't know what's wrong, and now everybody's upset with you on the bandstand because the bass just sounds bad. You always want to test these things out before you get to the gig, so when you get to the gig, you know exactly what you need to do. And that's my microphone drop right there.
Professor. One thing I really like that you talked about is just preparation from things like drop chords, know your surroundings. You'll be amazed at how many people go out there and just plug and play, don't think about the sound. And bad sound is like an instant turn off for anybody. So I really think that you mentioned that in your session today, whether you're a young player or you're an experienced player, the sound is everything. So do you have anything else on that?
No, other than making sure too that if you should always ask questions. So if you're going to play at a venue that you're unfamiliar with, that you don't know their setup, call ahead of time, call the actual venue and say, hey, I'm scheduled to perform there in the next couple of days. Is there anything that I need specifically to bring? Do you all carry a backline? Now, a lot of musicians won't know what that term is, but a backline is usually at the request of the performer or the artist to the venue to provide any equipment that the actual venue might house. So, for instance, some music venues will actually have a drum set or piano. It's been rare, but there's been times I've played a venue, they actually had a bass. The bass wasn't good, but they had a bass. So and they'll have speakers, amplifications, DI boxes for the bass player to plug in to go in through the house. Same with the keyboardists. They'll have gear. So you're allowed to ask that question. Say, hey, do you guys carry any backlines for like the rhythm section players, et cetera, et cetera? And they're like, oh no, everybody has to bring their own gear. So then So then you know exactly what you need to bring, et cetera, et cetera. So
perfect. It's great that You think ahead, get the best sound, know what's out there, and be prepared. And I know both the player and the listener will enjoy the experience the best.
Oh, one more thing I do want to add before I leave. I know I mentioned at the beginning of the video about showing up early. I remember I said that sometimes I'll show up an hour and a half. If it's a venue where, for instance, if I'm outdoors, for instance, or if it's a venue where I'm super unfamiliar with, I will go in there, set up, and start playing in the room, so I can get a feel for what I sound like in there. So I can already adjust how I'm going to sound by the time everybody else arrives, and I already know what it sounds like. And so when everybody else gets there, and everybody's like, "Wow, this sounds good," yeah, because I took care of everything else that needed to be taken care of before y'all got here. So that will always get you rehired, because that's, again, preparation and showing that you're putting in effort into making sure that this performance is going to go well.
Preparation, professionalism. Another awesome session from the professor, Brandon Robertson.
Appreciate it.
You heard it right from the mouth of the man. He's out there already doing it. And I mean, everywhere I go and I hear him play, it's always a beautiful experience with no sound issues. The band's always prepared and entertaining. So thank you so much for this session today, Professor. I want to remind everybody, if you really like what you're hearing, go out and tell other people about these great sessions you're hearing here free, matter of fact. www.clearwaterjazz.com/education, and we would love to hear back from you. Give us some feedback. Let us know how you're enjoying it. Or if you might have a topic you want us to suggest, email us at info@clearwaterjazz.com. I've been your guest host, Michael Knodel, and we've been here with the Professor, Brandon Robertson, today. And until next time, keep it swinging. Thank you, everybody.
Keep it swinging.